This is Gemara Yevamos Daf Nun Aleph. All the learning has been generously sponsored as a Schos Ilin Neshama for Chaim Mordechai ben and Naftali Tzvi. Mirz Hashem, the learning of the entire Chabura should bring Chaim Mordechai ben Naftali Tzvi to an higher place in Gan Eden Shel Ma'ila. As well as learning should be as Chos Shidduch V'Shol Chaim Devar Tam Tzvi Bas Parach Hashem ben Chayav Lum Yudis Bas Sima Malko Evi ben Teli Shom Levi Zahava. They shall find their appropriate shidduchim and bekar imam. As well as learning should be as Chos Shidduch V'Shol Shlema for Shmoyos ben Yeved Shmo ben Tilan Zalzim and Achlas Necham Bas Yivas Arbulum Bas Mindol Chaim Yishuv and Malko Shaveg Shirchana B'Soich Sha'ar Chayli Yisrael. So yesterday we finished this long and lengthy Mishnah. I'm aware that there's a little bit lacking clarity, which hopefully we'll gain today as we go through the Gemara, in which we'll dissect and explain really details in the Mishnah that were lacking. We began the Gemara, we ran through the first part, so I would like to run through the first part again. The first part again, really up to Matam. Let's really get a running start over here. So the Gemara began by saying that Ankan lo pligi al begerach hargadu maimer achar maimer. That the machlekes Rav Gamliel with the Chachamim, in which it's true we didn't fully deal with the nikuda, the point in which they're arguing about, which we're really going to get to today. But says the Gemara, the machlekes is when a get is after a get, or maimer achar maimer. Aval get echad biyavama, or maimer echad biyavama mehani. But they're both going to agree that if one Yevama gets a get and one Yevama gets a Maimer, that is going to work. Again, Maimer is going to be Kedushin Derabanan. Detail number one to remind yourselves. Detail number two is that you never let him marry two Yevamas. There's the din, there's the Xeris HaKos of the Bayis Echad, you only let it build one house, and you're not let it build the other house. And whenever you do Chalitza as well, that is the finishing story. You can't do anything else with the other Yevama. So when one get is given already, once you have, then it is considered that Kivan Sheyivne Shuvla Yibana, you're not allowed to build anymore, and therefore you cannot do Yibam afterwards. So says the Gemara, Matam, what is the reason that Amar Rabbanan get biyavama mahani? Why is this true? Why does a get given to Yevama? It's the wrong mechanics. Perhaps if we were to have asked this question before we learned Yevamas, one would say, what are you doing? Yibum or Chalitza? What's a get? A get is the wrong thing. What are you doing a get for? So why do the Rabbanan say that get would work in such a case? Says the Gemara, Mishom de Mahani Ba'alma. You know what the reason is? The reason is because a get works elsewhere. You're right. Midoraisa, a get does not do anything. But in this case, what are we concerned with? If you're going to tell me that the get does nothing, Amri, what's one going to say? Get lo yitzia v'chalitza lo yitzia. One will make a comparison and make a mistake that get and maimer or chalitza are the same thing. Hi, is everything okay?
Everything's okay. You're recording?
Yeah, I'm in the middle of recording. What's up? Okay. And of course, as always, Gezeir Derabanans are to remove one from an Isser. And we're afraid over here that one is going to compare and say a get severs a marriage, a chalitza severs a yevama. So maybe just like get in this scenario doesn't work, one would think the chalitza in this scenario of yibam does not work. And what's the problem? And we're afraid that one will do chalitza and then do a yibam, which of course does not work. And that's an isser deoraisa, an isser min ha'tayra, and therefore they made a gezerah that the get should do something. Therefore, they said that once a get is given, you can't have bia, you can't do yibam, even though ostensibly the get is nothing. But we're coming to concern in the case of chalitza. That is din number one. Continues the Gemara. That's why we said get works. Why do they say that maimer works? What's the reason for that? What's the gzir derabanan? That once one of the wives receives maimer, no one else could do yibam. You know why? A similar concern. Misham dimahani baal. The reason is Maimer normally works. A regular case, you do Kedushin, that works. Diamr loy mahani, we're afraid that if we say in our case it doesn't work, Amri Maimer liknais, you'll be a liknais. Again, they're going to make a comparison and think, just like Maimer is a way of doing an acquisition, of doing a kinyan, of doing a marriage, Bia is another way. They're going to erroneously think that Bia with the Yavam also doesn't work, which of course is not true. And they're going to come to go and be with the other widow, the other almana, the other Yevama, after a Bia was done, which of course again is an Isser Daraisa. So therefore they made a Din Derabanan that once you do Maimer with one of the wives, everyone else is off limits. That's Din number 2. And now din number 3. What is the reason that when they said that if you do a Bia Psula, that there is something afterwards, Yesh Acharei Klum, in comparison to Ein Acharei Klum, like we saw yesterday. So what is the reason that if you do a Bia Psula, it doesn't fully finish the story, like the case in the Mishnah of 2 Yevamas and 1 Yavam, and he did Maimer with one of them, and then he did Bia with that one. What did we say? We said that both of them require something, which is a Chiddush. Why should they require? Bia should do what? Bia should be 100%. It should consummate the marriage and no one else should leave anything. So what's the reason that in a scenario that it's a Bia Psula, that it's a scenario in which it's Maimer and then a Bia, it's not a regular scenario of a Bia, that we say that something can happen afterwards and thereby both of the Yevamos require? Amri, a similar concern. Ibi Acher Geti, you know what we're afraid of? Ibi Acher Geti, if they did Bia after a get was given, we're afraid that they'll do Bia after a get just like you'll do Bia after a Chalitza. And if it's the case of the Mishnah, there were 2 cases in the Mishnah. One was Bia Achar Get and one was Bia Achar Maimer. So in both cases there is concern. And that's the reason why we made a Gzeira D'Rabbanan that both women will require Chalitza and a get. And number 4 says the Gemara, now it's the exact opposite. Why is it that if Chalitza is done in such a scenario, Chalitza is done in a case after a Maimer, everything is finished? Says the Gemara, you know why? Amri, my ligzar, what's the concern in such a case? Nigzar chalitza achar get, mishul chalitza achar chalitza. What are we afraid of? That in this case of chalitza achar get, maybe we'll compare it to a case of chalitza after a chalitza. Says the Gemara, who cares? Kol ki hani techletz v'tezel. Let them do chalitza. Chalitza is not an isser. Let them do chalitza as much as they want. Ligzar chalitza achar maimer mishul chalitza achar bia. Rather, what are you nervous about? We should make a gezeira of when he did chalitza achar maimer, because maybe you'll do chalitza achar bia. Again, atu chalitza achar maimer miloi boi gelam amaroi. In the case of Chalitza Achar Maimer, what's the halacha? You need something for the Maimer, you need a get. So to do Chalitza Achar Bia, you're going to need a get, so there's no concern. So if a Chalitza is done, that's the stop button. Everything is severed, there is no concern. So those are the 3 cases in which there are concerns, Dir Abanan, and the 4th case of Chalitza in which there is no concern. So now comes along the Gemara and Amar Rava says, Rava, as we turn over to today's Daf Nun Aleph, Amar Aleph, and we really get into the meat and potatoes, the Machloikas, the first part of the Mishnah between Rav Gamliel and Bechacham. So says Rava, my time of the Rav Gamliel, where does Rav Gamliel come from? The Rav Gamliel says, there's no get achar get, there's no maimer achar maimer. That Rav Gamliel, and now let's speak out. What's the din that we're coming to explain? That if a get is given to 2 women, the halacha is, in the case of Yibam, Reuven dies, leaving over 2 wives to Shimon. The Shimon goes and does chalitza to one of Reuven's wives. That wife's relatives are now forbidden to Shimon, as we've learned many times. That when one does chalitza, it severs that bond, but it forces that all the other relatives of that woman are forbidden. So the chiddush of the Mishnah of Rav Gamliel of ein get acher get and ein maimer acher maimer is that the second woman's relatives are not aser. The second get is nothing. If they did a get to Rachel and then a get to Leah, Leah's relatives are still permissible to Shimon. So where does Rav Gamliel get this from? Says the Gemara, you know where he gets it from? The misafkale get idachi iloidachi. He's not sure. He is misupik. Does a get work or not? Maimer ikani iloikani. And he's not sure, does Maimer work? Now let's explain. Get idachi iloidachi. He's not sure if get does something, it pushes away again. Get in the case of Yibum, get normally is for a regular marriage, Rahman al-Islam. But in this case, in the case of Yibum, what does Shimon do instead of Yibum or Chalitza? He gives a get. So Rav Gamliel is not sure, Idachi, Loidachi. And therefore, let's explain. Ikama dachi. Basar Maikov, if the get works and it severs that bond, severs that woman, so Basar Maikov, the second get is doing nothing. And Ikama Loidachi. And if you're going to tell me that the first get doesn't do anything, Basar Nami Loidachi, then the second get will as well not do anything. And that is the reason why when he gives two gain to these two wives, he is not forbidden to the second wife's relatives. Because Mimanav Shach, whichever way you look at it, the second wife's relatives are permissible to him. And similarly explains the Gemara 5 lines down, Maimer yikani lekani kama kani. If the Maimer on the first wife works, Basra Maikavid, he's not doing anything because he's already married to the first wife. And that is the reason why Rav Gamliel says that multiple Maimers in the case of Yibum only works on one, the second one is nothing, and you're still allowed to marry the relatives of the second one. Excuse me, I read that incorrectly. Go back. Rav Gamliel, sheish get acher get, v'get acher bia sheish get acher maimer, umaimer acher haget, v'get acher bia umaimer acher bia get. That is a statement, a Braisa quoting Abaya, in which Rav Gamliel admits to those four dinim. And now the Gemara explains, Vi misafle Rav Gamliel, and if the way that you, Rava, explained Shittas Rav Gamliel, which was what Rav Gamliel is unsure whether get or maimer works, Tavi kibiyah lechatchila, then let in any scenario in which there is a biyah, even if it's after a maimer, even if it's after a get, it should be like a regular biyah that's done originally, and therefore nothing vitikni, and should affect the full acquisition, and they should be fully married. Why? As we learned in the Mishnah, so asks Abaya, if the way that you're explaining it is that Rav Gamliel is misopik, it can't be. Because in this brisa, it's clear that he's not misopik. Because if he was misopik, the biyah should work. So Abai comes along and says a new pshat Rav Gamliel. Loilam shitalei Rav Gamliel begat the dachi. Rav Gamliel holds the get pushes away. Maimer dekani and a maimer is kaina, like it normally does. What does a get generally do? It severs a marriage. What does a maimer normally do? Kedushin deraban. So what is Rav Gamliel's concern? Miu amar rabbanan hayivama bechad sad mahani baget. And the concern over here is get severs, but not 100%. Maimer acquires, but not 100%. So the concern over here is that the Yevama, on one hand, b'chad sad, the get helps, u'b'chad sad, the maimer helps, and therefore what? Get acher get loy dachi. One get after another get doesn't do anything. Because once the first one pushed away, let's look it into percentage just to put it into, make it a little bit easier to understand. Let's say a normal get severs 100%. So over here, again in the case of Yibum, let's just use the word 50%. It severs 50%. So once the get severs 50%, the second get can't sever anything more. It already severed 50%. And similarly, why? Because the first one already was kaina. And whatever that amount was, let's say the same thing. Maimer's a 50% kinyan. So once the first Maimer did 50%, the second Maimer can't add anything on. And that is the reason in the Mishnah that Rav Gamliel says that a get after a get, or a maimer after a maimer, the second one does nothing, because it's adding on to itself. It already did what it does, and it's over. But get acher maimer or maimer acher get, in this situation of the brisa, when the maimer is after a get or a get is after a maimer, then each one is acting on a different part of this woman, and that is the reason why it's chal. If he does a get and he severs it 50%, and he does a maimer and he acquires 50%, that is the reason why they both have a place to take hold. And that is Abaya's explanation of Rav Gamliel. And now he answers how it's not a stira to the brisa. The Rabbanon comes along. The Rabbanon, and what do they say? Kochad v'chatakin le Rabbanon get umaymer biyavama. Says the Rabbanon, each and every woman has a get and a maimer, and therefore says the Rabbanon, you want to know, is there get after get? Yes. Is there maimer after maimer? Yes. You know why? Because each woman is looked individually, each woman is looked separately. And therefore, says the Rabbanon, that when Shimon gives a get to Rachel and then gives a get to Leah, yes, Shimon is also usher to Leah's relatives. When Shimon gives a maimer to Rachel and then gives a maimer to Leah, Shimon is usher to Leah's relatives. Why? Because each Yevamo, through the eyes of Rachel, through the eyes of Leah, each one has the ability to accept a get or a maimer. And that is Rav Abaya's way of explaining the machlekes, Rav Gamliel, and the Chacham. Asks the Gemara, V'hai bia psula adifa mimaimer ugriya mimaimer. And this bia psula, in the case in which Rav Gamliel explained the brisa, that there's a bia after a maimer, a bia after a get, adifa mimaimer ugriya mimaimer. On one hand it's better, and on one hand it is worse. Adifa mimaimer dilu maimer echar maimer loy mahani. Why is it better? Because a maimer after a maimer doesn't help. Whereas be after maimer will help, like we just explained. And on the other hand, ugriya mi maimer. Dilu maimer achar aget kani lekule shira de get. Vilu be achar aget lo kani lekule shira de get. So explains the Gemara that according to the way that Rav Gamliel is explaining, in the sheet of Abaya, there is something left for the subsequent Bia and Maimer to take hold of. And now says the Gemara, Tana Rabbanan, we're 10 lines to the wide lines. The first one line is lay. Now the Gemara is going to go a bit deeper into this machlekes Rav Gamliel and the Chachamim in a brisa. Says the brisa, Tana Rabbanan, Keitad Amar Rav Gamliel in Garach Get. When did Rav Gamliel say his din in our Mishnah? The Mishnah that started this parak, the 5th parak, said Rav Gamliel, there's no Garach Get. Keitad, where does Rav Gamliel say this din? Says the Gemara, there were 2 Yevamos, like we explained. Ruvain dies and his 2 wives, Rachel and Leah, fall to Yibam, to Shimon. V'nasan gelazev gelazu, and Shimon goes and gives a get to each and every one. Rav Gamliel loimer choyleitz larishayna v'asar kravei seah u'motav kravei shniya. Says Rav Gamliel, what do you have to do right now? You do chalitza to the first one, you're also to the first relatives, but the second one you're mutter. Why? Like we explained, Rav Gamliel lo din get achar get in maimer achar maimer. So the second get in maimer to Leah does nothing. Proof in the pudding, you're still going to be mutter to Leah's relatives. Chachamim maimer, and they argue. They say no, nasan get lazu v'get lazu. They both require a get, and also and you're also to both of their relatives, v'chalitza lachas mehem, and one of them requires chalitza. And concludes the brayso v'cheinat ha'omer b'shnei yavamim v'yavam echad. And so too in the reverse, we just had a case of Shimon with 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Says the Gemara, it's the same thing with Shimon and Levi with 1 wife. And Kate Sada, and in what case Amar Rav Gamliel in Maimer Achar Maimer, that was get achar get. Continues the brayso. When does Rav Gamliel say there is not Maimer Achar Maimer? Shtei Yevamos Rachel and Leah fall to 1 Yavam to Shimon Basar Maimer Bezu. And Shimon goes and does Kiddushin der Rabbanan to both Rachel and Leah. Rav Gamliel Leimer Noisin Galerishan V'Chayletz La Basar B'Kravei Sel Umotar B'Kravei Shniya. Says Rav Gamliel, only the first one you got to get rid of, but the second one you're still mutter because there was nothing that happened. The second mimer was nothing. The Chachamim mimer, no. No, saying get l'shteihem, they both require a get. Also require l'shteihem, a chalitza la'achas mehem. V'cheinat ha'omer, and similarly, we say Yevamos, v'Yevama echos. That was a wonderful brisa, which really just elaborated and explained very nicely the din in the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, mar. Continues the Gemara and says, Amar Mar, what was the end of the brisa? The end of the brisa was two Yevamos with one, not the end of the brisa. Amar Mar, in the original case of two Yevamos, Rachel and Leah falling to Shimon. What do we say? Nosen get lazu v'get lazu, Rav Gamliel Amar Chaylis Arishayna v'asar Kravesau, Mutter v'Kraveshniya. Rav Gamliel held, you're mutter to the second relatives. Why? Because the second Maimer didn't do anything. The second get didn't do anything. Says the Gemara from this Rav Gamliel, we could say limit have to the Shmuel to Kasha and Shmuel Damar Shmuel. Chaylitz labal saket. Loy niftarot Sarah. Shmuel says no. One chalitza does not help. According to Rav Gamliel, let's play out the case when Shimon goes to get to Rachel and Leah. What did Shimon have to do afterwards? He has to do one chalitza, get rid of Rachel and Leah's relatives. He's still mutter too. But Shmuel said not that way. Shmuel said one chalitza does not patter up the Sarah. So seemingly Rav Gamliel is a kasha. Explains the Gemara, Shmuel ki amrini ana liva demand amar. Yesh Zika. Here it is. This is what we began discussing yesterday. That the bedrock of this machlokes, perhaps we said when we learned the Mishnah, and now we're going to delve into this, is whether there is a Zika or not. Something we've dealt with extensively. Do you hold Yesh Zika or Ain Zika? Zika Kikenusa is a Zika at the level that once it falls Leibum, it's as if they're married. So said Shmuel, the reason why I hold and I said that one chalitza does not help, because the Zika to the second wife is a Zika, is Kikanus, as if they're married, so that second wife needs something. For Rav Gamliel Saver, Ain Zika. Rav Gamliel argues with me. He owes Ain Zika. Since he owes Ain Zika, that's the reason why you don't need anything for the second wife. So says the Gemara, the Gamliel Saver, Ain Zika. For the fact you're telling me Rav Gamliel holds that there's no Zika, what's the obvious implication in the Mishnah? The Machlekes was Rav Gamliel and the Rabbanan, and we turn over to Amid Beis. Rabbanan Savri Yesh Zika. So the Rabbanan argue, and they must hold that there is a Zika. Vekotani Seifa, what did the Seifa of the Mishnah say? The same din is with two Yevamim, Shimon and Levi, with one Yevama Rachel. So Levi Tavituf the Rabbi Rav Huna, Satakashim Rav Huna, Amarab, why? Damarav Huna, Amarav, Chalitza Psula, Sricha Lachzar Kolachin. And if according to the Rabbanan, we're saying Yesh Zika. Yet, what does Rabbi Ravuna say? You have to be sricha, you have to go to each and every brother. But we just said in the Mishnah, they don't have to go to each and every brother. One chalitza will suffice. Not like Rabbi Ravuna Marav, which we've already seen in previous daf, and we'll see again in 2 days, who says that if the chalitza is deficient, if it's not a proper chalitza, you need to go to each and every brother. Amr l'cha Rabbi Ravuna, bein the Rabbi Gamliel, bein the Rabbanan Savri, Ain Zika. Says Rabbi Ravuna, you just like Shmuel just explained the machlokes of Gamliel and the Rabbanan is Yesh Zika, Ain Zika. Says Ravuna, it's not true. Everyone agrees Ain Zika. And therefore, it's not a kasha on me, Rabbi Ravuna, because I hold Yesh Zika. Because I hold Yesh Zika, therefore there's a connection to both wives or both brothers. And therefore you have to go to every brother, every wife. But Rav Gamliel and the Rabbanan both hold Ain Zika, and they're arguing about a separate detail. But that machlokes is not based upon whether you hold Yesh Zika or Ain Zika. It's a separate machlokes. Beautiful. So continues the Gemara. 8 lines down. The first one line is Kamiflagi. Amar. Asa Maimer Bezuma, Maimer Bezura, Gamliel, Reno together, Rishon of a Chaylitzla, Vasa B'Kravesau, Umotiv B'Kraveshniya. What did Rav Gamliel teach us? The second Maimer is nothing. You're mutter to the second one's relatives. Says the Gemara Mechti. Let's dissect this a little bit. So Rav Gamliel in Maimer Achar Maimer. Rav Gamliel holds, as we just said, there's no subsequent double Maimer. So Rishon and Nami Tisyabim. So the first one should also require Yibam. Rishon and Nami Tisyabim. You should be allowed to do Yibam. You did Maimer Kedush and the Rabbanan to Rachel. Then he did Maimer Kedush and the Rabbanan to Leah. The second Maimer is nothing. So great. Why do you have to get divorced? To marry Rachel. Do Yibam. Finish off the party. Why are we making you get divorced from everyone? Explains the Gemara back to the way the shir started. Gezeira damas leibumay shniya. It's a gezeira. You might come to do yibum from the second one. You think they're both maimer. It's the same thing, and of course it doesn't work. And therefore, says the Gemara, that's why you're not allowed to. Amar Rav Yochanan ben Gamliel. Amar Rav Yochanan, excuse me. Rav Gamliel, Beishamai, Rav Shimon ben Azai. Rav Shimon uben Azai, excuse me. Viran Nechemya. Kulu svira lahu maimer koine kinyan gamer. This is a direct segue off of what we just finished, because we just dealt with the sheet of Rav Gamliel. So once we see that Rav Gamliel is of the opinion that Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer, and so much so that the Gemara just suggested that the second Maimer is nothing, and from the first Maimer you really can even do Yibam. Says the Gemara, you know what else holds this way? Beishamai, Rav Shimon ben Azai, Rav Nechemya. They all hold the same din. They all hold that Maimer is Koine Kinyan Gomer. Comes along the Gemara right now, and says the Gemara, let's deal with all these opinions. Let's figure out what exactly, where do we know that they all hold that the Maimer is an absolute kinyan. Rav Gamliel, Hadamar, like we just said. Beishamai, where's Beishamai? This should hopefully be a bit familiar. We had this, I believe, already. Beishamai, yes, we didn't Chavtes. Shloishach and Shnaimim Nisun the Shtei Achayis. We have three brothers, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, that are married to two sisters, Rachel and Leah. Ve'echad Mofna, and Levi's not married to anyone. Meis Echad Bali Achayis, Reuven dies, and therefore his wife Rachel falls to Yibum to Shimon and Levi. V'asaba Mofna Maimer, and Levi does Maimer Kedushin derabanan. V'achar Kach Meis Acha V'Sheni, and then Shimon dies. So Levi is Kedushin derabanan to Reuven's wife. Shimon dies, and his wife now also falls to Levi. Beishamai oimriv ishta yimai v'alzu teitzim shemachas isha. Says Beishamai, you don't have to do anything. Levi is married to Reuven's wife. Shimon's wife that has fell to Yibam, get out of here. What do you mean? You're not fully married to Reuven's wife. Yes, you are, because Beishamai holds Maimer is a kinyan gomer. Even though you really only did Maimer, you really only did Kedusha derabanan. Says Beishamai, that's enough. And therefore, once Levi does Maimer, Shimon's subsequent wife doesn't have to do anything. Number 3, such Rav Gamliel, that's Beishamai. V'Rav Shimon the Tanya Amrlu Rav Shimon lechachamim bia rishayna bia shniya bia sheni einay bia and bia rishayna bia sheni nami einay bia. Says the Gemara, V'ha bia is ben tisha the Maimer shavyi, and this is a mission that we'll get to in about a month or two's time. A mission that deals with a katan aged 9 to 13 that is acquiring and acting on the Yevama, but he can't really do Yibam because he's a Katan. So the Gemara there says that the Bia of a Katan is the status of a Maimer. Because the Bia of a Katan is a din of a Bia. It's just he can't do a real Kedushin, he can't do Yibam. So the Gemara explains that the Bia is a quasi Yibam. What's a quasi Yibam? Maimer, Kedushin the Rabbana. So says the Gemara, Bia is Bentisha as the Kamaimer Shavi Rabban. It's like Maimer. And what did Rav Shimon hold? Just getting it more, abstractly, and we'll delve into it more when we get there in a few months. Rav Shimon said the Lashon, Bia's Rishon Bia, Bia Sheni Einei Klum. So if there's two brothers who are Ketanim, and the first one, this 9-year-old, does Bia, the second one is nothing. Why not? Must be because the Maimer, the Bia of a 9-year-old, which is the status of a Maimer, is 100%. Oraya, the Rav Shimon holds the Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer. The Gomer Rav Shimon ain't no Bia, that the second one's Bia is nothing. Oraya, the Rav Shimon holds the Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer. Ben Azai number 4, Titani Ben Azai Amar Yish Maimer Achamaimer B'shnei Yevamim Yevama Echas. But Vein Maimer Achamaimer B'shnei Yevamos Yevam Echad. Why not? Must be just like we said a moment ago, because the original Maimer is absolute. And finally, Rav Nechemya Detanan Rav Nechemya Omer Achas Bila B'Achas Chalitza Bein B'Tchil Bein Enzo Mitzayif In Achrei Klum, like we learned in the Mishnah. Whether you do Yibam, whether you do Chalitza, whether in the middle, whether at the end, at any point of the story, it's absolute. In Achrei Klum, it's 100%. Ask the Gemara about Bia Psula the Kamaimer Shavya. This is a Bia Psula. It's not a real Bia because, let's say, they did a Maimer first, they did a Get first, and then they did a Bia. And yet, what does Rav Nechemya hold that the subsequent Bia, even though it has the status of a Maimer, is absolute? Shavir Rabbanim v'Ketani In Achrei Klum is the Raya. The Rav Nechemya holds Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer, and those are our 4 Shitais. Rav Gamliel, Beishamai, Ben Azai, and Rav Nechemya, all holding Maimer Koine Kinyan Gomer. We'll pick it up from the next part of the Mishnah, the next year, B'siyata Dishmaya.